They sat parked comfortably in the front seats of their van, gazing upon the roped-off trail just a few feet away. Just one more stop, she thought. She looked at him lovingly, grasping his hand, and smiled. Shall we? He grinned warmly back at her, admiring the gold flecks in her blonde hair as the sun shone through the trees and highlighted her delicate face. He made a gesture towards the door. We shall. They exited the camper van and headed towards the worn-out "Do Not Enter" sign that hung weakly from the decrepit and worn trees it was nailed to. Hey, did you grab the extra water bottles? She called. He glanced behind his shoulder, observing her kneeling down, scavenging through her backpack in a fury, and amused how she was always so disorganized and chaotic whenever planning their hiking trips. The corner of his mouth curled upwards in a wide smirk while observing her frantic search. Yes, dear, he answered confidently while admiring her. In her frenzy of searching, he drew his attention back to himself and paused. Shit. Wait, did I? He quickly took a brief inventory search of what he had before catching her eye. Second guess yourself, Mr. Confident? She caught up to him, grinning, her hands firmly planted on her hips, and a cocky smile beheld her lips as she peered at him with the gotcha gaze. He raised an inquisitive brow to her and then peered around the thick, dense forest they were about to traverse and felt the slightest bit of unease as he scanned the trails ahead of them. Thick, multicolored fall leaves decorated the monstrous redwood trees. Most of the paths were overgrown and covered with waist-high bushes. He took note of the silence. She shifted her backpack, adjusting the straps, and peered at him, noting his discomfort. Maybe there was a reason the "Do Not Enter" sign was blocking the entrance. She peered at him with a slight look of concern. Her brows knit together, observing the surrounding area, while the slightest bit of angst grew in her. Although the forest was eerily dark, ominous beams of scarlet-colored light peeked through the trees and leaves above. She couldn't recall a sky that looked like this before. This won't take more than a couple of hours. He paused, gathering his thoughts and battling the urge to leave. Besides, you were the one that wanted to get a look at this infamous waterfall. He was right. She impulsively stuck her tongue out at him and giggled. She had been the one that nagged him about stopping here, even though they really hadn't had the time to. It had been 3 weeks into their journey across the U.S. Their itinerary had been planned down to the exact place to eat and time of arrival. With only 4 months allotted to see the country, time was of the essence. Their never-ending bucket list seemed to be growing by the day. She sighed briefly, drawing her attention back to him. Yeah, you're right. He nodded back at her victoriously. I know. I always am. He grinned back at her and winked. As stubborn as she was, and hated to admit it, her husband was, usually, always right. She gave him a light jab to the shoulder and rolled her eyes. He turned his heel and headed towards the trail that was marked falls. The trail, overgrown and at times, disappeared, making them question if they were following it correctly. Each step forward into the woods brought about more uncertainty. The crimson light persisted and appeared to be stronger as the woods grew more colliginous. Dampness hung in the air, making their clothes cling to them tightly. Their legs, laden, pushing through the tall grass and sizable debris of broken branches that haphazardly lay on the unpredictable trail. Their paths grew more cumbersome by the minute. The woods appeared to manifest into darkness, as if swallowing them up an abyss that slowly enveloped them. He couldn't tell, but he was sure they hadn't been there for more than 30 minutes. Yet, the progression into the depth of the forest felt off, being that it was only 1 o'clock when they started on the trail. He peered at his watch, fearing that maybe this wasn't the best idea as the woods bestowed its dark blanket upon them. What's wrong? She gazed at him with concern, gripping her backpack straps anxiously. My watch stopped. He poked at it, tapping the digital glass as if hoping that somehow it would suddenly work. He grimaced, peering back at her. I think we should head back. I've lost service and something just doesn't feel right. Unease burrowed deeper in the pit of his stomach. Disappointment hung on her, knowing that this was most likely the only chance they would have to find this enchanting sight. But her gut told her something was definitely off, despite them being alone. She couldn't help but feel watched. Crickets chirped consistently, gradually resounding more and more audible. Their pitch and tones seemed to almost shriek in unison, as if warning them in some way. She covered her ears, scrunching her face in disdain. Yeah, let's head back to the van. Crows overhead squawked more and more clamorous, their wings whirled in large, audible wishes, but couldn't be seen. The wind slowly howled, just barely audible. Branches snapped randomly around them, as if heavy-footed creatures lurked in the distance encircling them. The woods shifted, feeling more and more threatening. A disturbing and heavy feeling crept over them like long bony fingers digging its nails into them. It felt as if air was escaping them slowly and gradually, and a crow's feeling gripped and tore at her stomach. Her legs felt heavy, walking back as she led them out of the forest. Her lungs tightly constricting, and her breath labored as if she were hiking up a steep mountain. Sweat beaded and crept down her forehead, slowly running down her face. Wait, this isn't the right way. She paused mid-walk. Anxiety clawed at her throat as she tried to swallow down the large-sized lump that rested there. The trail had vanished beneath her. Her eyes quickly surveyed the ground, pushing the grass aside with her hiking boot. She stopped, frustration and worry building and bubbling inside of her. The woods were so silent. She immediately noticed the loud chirping of the crickets ceased to exist. Her breath quickened with the realization that hit her like a truck. I think we're lost. The words felt dead and heavy at the same time as they left her lips. Her throat ran dry while that persistent expanding lump lingered. While she surveyed the scenery ahead of them, she suddenly realized that he hadn't said anything this whole time. She swiftly turned around towards him and froze. Her heart immediately launched into panic mode as blood pumped through her veins at lightning speed. The air grew thicker, making her slightly gasp. Terror soon enveloped her as she stood there staring at nothing. He was gone. The silence was deafening. Her brain desperately scrambled to make sense of it. She attempted to call out to him but couldn't. She stood paralyzed while trepidation gripped her with its dominant claws. A large snap from a tree behind her made her swing around to see a corpse-like deer staring at her, its hollow eyes vermilion in color glaring at her, unmoving with half its skull exposed. Its rotted flesh and fur was barely clinging to the remaining bones. She gasped in horror, desperately trying to catch her breath. Just a few feet away from where she stood, a second sizable crack made her whirl around as another zombie-like deer with the same colored eyes stood gazing at her. The inauspicious red beams of light that enveloped the woods pierced through its torso, bearing a cavity large enough to see through it. With its heavy gaze upon her, the deer contorted its neck slowly and abnormally, while blood seeped from its mouth. Their ominous and menacing presence evoked a fear in her that she had never experienced before. She couldn't move, nor run. It was as if fear held her in its heavy grasp, keeping her frozen in place. She covered her eyes as the woods enclosed upon her, her body violently trembling, while the uncontrollable tears streamed down her face. A warm liquid slowly streamed from her hairline onto her fingers. It startled her, forcing her hands away to discover the crimson-colored fluid enveloping her delicate fingers. She stared at her hands, while the fluid oozed down her body towards her feet. Its putrid smell of iron and rust caused an overwhelming sensation of nausea, overcoming her senses. This shocking revelation led her to the realization of it being blood. It dripped more forcefully, hitting her in the head with hard thumps that bounced off of her and landed on the tangled tree roots below. A tree adjacent to her shifted and cracked. The crimson fluid spilled out of the broken openings, flowing down and pooling near her feet. More pops and snaps reverberated throughout the woods, The trees had come alive, hissing and moving while blood spilled from their trunks. She stepped back, but fell to the ground, tripping over the brambles of tangled roots. Her boot, encased in the mess of rotted vines and branches, held her against her will. She kicked and flailed, attempting to break herself free, but the vines tightened and trailed up her legs, squeezing her calf tightly. She was trapped. Blood dripped more forcefully from the sky, coming down in a fierce, steady downpour. The oversized thorns attached to the vines pierced through her clothes as they encased and penetrated her skin. They continued upward, enclosing around her body. Her chest was tight, her lungs collapsing, causing her breath to escape her lips. She gasped, desperately fighting for air, barely breathing. Her head constricted with pierced, sharp pains pummeling at her skull. She grabbed at her neck, desperate for her last breath, as the vines encased her throat, tightly squeezing. The woods faded to black, until all that could be seen were hundreds of blood-colored eyes glaring at her. With its hot breath heavy on her ear, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come here."